States, we still have the federal government and in collusion with the American Dental Association going to various cities, even small cities, using their pressure, their money, taxpayer money, to try to force local city councils to fluoridate the water. In the state of California, in fact, they've ordered the fluoridation of all waters in every city and village over 10,000 inhabitants, whether they vote to not fluoridate their water or not. So you have to ask the question, well, now that scientifically we've proven that fluoridating water has no effect on reducing cavities, why is the federal government spending so much money and effort to force fluoridation of the rest of the water supply? And even insisting that bottled water be fluoridated, that no one would have access to unfluoridated water except the elite. Well, if we look at the scientific studies on what is the effect of fluoridation, well, we know fluoridating water through a number of studies, some of which were ordered by the federal government itself in the earlier days, increases cancer risk. Burke and Yamin, two scientists, did one of the largest cancer studies in relationship to fluoridating water supply. They looked at all cities, 10 cities in the eastern part of the United States. And they showed that in fluoridated cities, as compared to unfluoridated, there was a 10% increase in cancer. This was a criticized study, so they repeated it, and they did all cities east of the Mississippi, above 10,000 population, comparing fluoridated and unfluoridated. Now, what they did, they compared the cancer statistics before fluoridation and then 13 to 17 years after fluoridation. Again, they found there was a 10% increase cancer death incidence in the cities that had been fluoridated. Now, when you say cancer death incidence, that means people who died of cancer. You can appreciate there's going to be a lot more people who developed cancer who didn't die. So the actual cancer incidence is much higher. This study was so impressive to some members of Congress, they ordered a study of this link to cancer through the Battelle Research Institute. These studies showed that, number one, it produced a number of types of cancer, one which was a very rare liver cancer, and it significantly increased the growth of cancer in people who already had cancers. Well, despite these studies, they're still fluoridating water. They found out it increased fractures, not only in the elderly, but in younger women. And it increased hip fractures in older men to a greater extent than the women. Well, a hip fracture in someone over 65 has a high mortality rate. So it's a good way, if you wanted to increase the mortality of the elderly and get them out of the way, which is in discussion today. We know that it has profound effects on the brain. One of the most impressive was done by Dr. Phyllis Mullenix, who was a highly regarded neurotoxicologist, someone who studies the toxicity of different elements on the brain. Well, she was drafted into doing this when she worked for the Forsyth Dental Research Institute. And she had never worked with fluoride, didn't know a lot about it. Now, I know this firsthand because I've interviewed her and talked with her, and I know her. And she said when she first was going to do the research project to see if fluoridating water had any effect on the brain's function, she thought it would be negative. She didn't think fluoride would have any adverse effects on the brain. She did one of the largest studies that's been done in animals to see the effect of fluoridating water on their brain function. And she used a very innovative modern technique. And in this technique, she used computers to see the behavior of the animal so that it was totally objective. There was no subjective influence by the researcher themselves. That had never been done before, and all this was high-tech equipment. She completed her study, and to her surprise, the fluoride produced two main effects. If you fed the fluoride to a pregnant animal, the offspring then became hyperactive. In other words, like ADHD. If you gave the fluoride after birth, the animal became very lethargic. sort of like a couch potato, didn't really want to do anything, became very apathetic acting. So this was a very clear effect with objective, computerized evaluation of the behavior of these animals. She used over 500 animals. She completed this research, and she also measured the fluoride levels in the animal's brain and found some very interesting things. It's that fluoride tends to accumulate in the part of the brain that controls behavior, particularly the hippocampus and the other limbic areas of the brain. She brought this research to the National Institutes of Health. They asked her to present this and the results of her research. Well, at the same time, after she wrote up her research, she had presented it in one of the very prestigious journals to be published, and they didn't know it. So she presented it to the National Institute of Health, and their response was very cold. And she said when she was walking through the National Institutes of Health, all the walls were adorned with big posters proclaiming the effectiveness of fluoridation of water and promoting the fluoridation of water. And she said, this isn't a very objective audience I'm speaking to. Well, they were very hostile and very cold to her during her presentation and didn't even ask questions. So when she got back to her institute, they asked her about sending this to a journal to be published. And they wanted the name of the journal. Well, she wouldn't tell them because she knew they would try to stop the publication, try to influence the journal not to publish it. So she wouldn't tell them, and it was published, much to their dismay and anger, and a wide audience of scientists began to look at this research, which for the first time proved that fluoride added to water in the concentrations that humans are exposed to was producing profound changes in the brain and altering behavior of young animals exposed to it. We have to realize at the time, women were adding fluoridated water to reconstitute the baby food. Well, over half of babies get reconstituted baby food. They're not breastfed. So this was tens of millions of babies were being exposed to concentrations of fluoride that were used in this experiment. Where she, after they found that this had been published, they fired her. And the Forsyth Dental Research Institute, in fact, about that time, had gotten a $250,000 grant from the Colgate Company, which fluoridates their toothpaste. So she was fired from her job. She's never gotten another federal grant. And she was one of the top neurotoxicologists in the world. She had created this innovative new system. Well, she went back to her lab to get the rat's brains so that she could continue research on her own. It turns out they had flooded the lab, claimed there was a break in a water pipe. It destroyed her computer system, and they killed all the rats and incinerated them. So there was no tissue left to do any studies on. All of these things look rather suspicious, so you know, you have to come to your own conclusion. What does this mean? Number one, we know that there's numerous health effects of adding fluoride to water. We know fluoride bioaccumulates in the human body. That means it just keeps getting higher and higher concentrations the more you drink water. If you want to produce the highest concentration of a mineral, you don't put it in the food, you put it in the water, because people drink a lot of water, particularly in warmer climates. So that produces the highest level of bioaccumulation, and that's what we were seeing. Well, Dr. Yamagiannis did some studies and looked at the different tissues in the body, found out the highest accumulation was in the thyroid gland. It had been known that one way to reduce thyroid function was to put fluoride in the water, that it produced a significant hypothyroidism, or low function of the thyroid gland. Now, not only does that produce lethargy, apathy, weakness, tiredness in adults, but if you do it in pregnant women, the babies are born with low IQs and they never recover. So even mild reduction of thyroid function in pregnant women has now been shown to produce significant neurobehavioral problems in their offspring.